You ever wonder if the universe has a twisted sense of humor, or if some people are just born with a fundamental glitch in their software that makes them think they own the air you breathe? 5 years ago, I thought I'd finally cracked the code to a perfect life. I'd retired after 25 years as a federal land surveyor, a job that mostly involved arguing with mountains and correcting the mistakes of people who couldn't tell a property line from a laundry line. And I bought 12 acres of rugged, beautiful timberland in the high country of Montana. I wasn't looking for neighbors, I wasn't looking for drama, and I sure as hell wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted a place where the only thing I had to listen to was the wind through the ponderosa pines and the occasional elk bugling in the draw. But life has a funny way of reminding you that peace is something you have to defend, sometimes with a stack of legal documents and a very long memory. I spent nearly 2 years building my cabin, and I'm not talking about some prefab kit. I mean a real, hand-hewn sanctuary with a wraparound porch that gives me a front-row seat to the sunrise over the Bitterroot Range. I did everything by the book. I surveyed that land myself 4 times before I even poured the concrete. I had the deeds verified, the easements double-checked, and the pins set in stone. Literally, because when you spent your career fixing other people in oppos, boundary disasters, you make damn sure your own backyard is airtight. For a while, it was heaven. I'd wake up, brew a pot of coffee that could strip paint, and sit on my porch watching the hawks circle the valley, thinking I'd finally escaped the bureaucracy and the petty power struggles of the city. But then about 3 years in, the gold-plated nightmare, moved in next door. Now, my land borders a high-end development called Whispering Ridge, a place for people who want to, live in nature, as long as nature is manicured, gated, and comes with a monthly HOA fee that costs more than my truck. Most of the folks there are fine. They stay on their side of the fence, and I stay on mine. But their HOA president, a woman named Beatrice Sterling, didn't seem to understand the concept of, boundaries, either physical or social. Beatrice was the kind of person who wore designer hiking boots that had never touched actual mud and carried a clipboard like it was a holy relic, and the first time she marched up my driveway, I knew my quiet life was under siege. She didn't end oppos. T lead with a, hello, or a, nice to meet you, She just stood there, squinting at my woodpile through her oversized sunglasses, and told me that my, unstructured timber storage, was a visual blight that violated the community's aesthetic harmony. I just stood there, leaning on my maul, and politely reminded her that I wasn't in oppos. Part of her HOA, that my land had been there long before their gated community was a twinkle in a developer in oppos, and that I liked my woodpile exactly where it was. She gave me this thin, brittle smile, the kind people use when they're already imagining how they're going to ruin you, and said that, community standards, have a way of flowing downhill, and that I'd be hearing from her again. And boy, did I hear from her. Over the next 6 months, I received a series of increasingly absurd letters delivered by a private courier, demanding I repaint my cabin because the rustic cedar, was too dark, or that I remove my amateur radio tower because it interfered with the, skyline silhouette, I ignored them all. I even used a couple of the more threatening ones to light my wood stove on a cold October night, thinking she was just a bored bully who'd eventually find a new target, but Beatrice wasn't, and oppos. Just bored, she was calculated. She started showing up at the edge of my property with, consultants, pointing at the ridge where I'd built my detached workshop and guest suite, and then the bomb dropped. I was out back, greasing the tracks on my skid steer, when Beatrice arrived with a young, nervous-looking guy in a suit who looked like he'd never seen a dirt road in his life. She handed me a formal, notice of encroachment, claiming that according to a new, internal audit, of the Whispering Ridge Master Plat, my entire workshop and about 30 feet of my eastern driveway were actually sitting on HOA common ground. She told me I had 60 days to vacate the structure and, restore the landscape, to its natural state, or the HOA would seize the building and bill me for the demolition. I looked at the map she attached. It was a joke, a grainy satellite printout with red lines drawn over it that looked like they'd been done by a toddler with a marker. And I started to laugh, but Beatrice was in oppos. Laughing, she looked me dead in the eye and said, We have the resources to tie you up in court until you're too old to remember why you moved here, Mr. Miller. Just give us the land, and we'll waive the fines, end quote. That was the moment the old federal inspector in me woke up, the part of me that doesn't and oppose. T like being lied to and hates seeing the truth mangled by people with too much money and not enough character. I didn't oppose. TL, I didn't oppose. T threatened. I just took the papers and told her to get off my land before I called the sheriff for trespassing. As she walked away, she shouted back that I was making a, end quote, $1 million mistake, end quote. And in a way, she was right, but not the way she thought. I went inside, pulled out my old Trimble GPS unit, the high-precision kind they use for geological surveys, and headed out to my eastern line. I'd set the pins myself years ago, hammered them 3 feet deep, and topped them with brass caps, so I knew exactly where they should be. But when I got to the first marker near the old creek bed, it was gone. I dug around in the dirt, thinking maybe a heavy runoff had buried it. But then I found it, or rather, I found where it used to be. The earth was soft, recently disturbed, and the pin had been moved about 40 feet west, deeper into my property. I checked the next one and the one after that, and it was the same story. Someone had come onto my land under the cover of darkness, pulled the official survey markers, and reset them to create the illusion that my workshop was on HOA land. I felt a cold, sharp anger settling in my chest, the kind of anger that makes you very rat quiet and very, very focused. I didn't oppose. T call her, I didn't oppose. T confront her, I just call an old friend of mine, a guy named Silas who runs the most respected surveying firm in the state and doesn't oppose. T take bribes from developers. I told him I needed a certified, end quote, court-ready, end quote, boundary verification, and I needed it yesterday. Silas and his crew spent 3 days on my ridge, using lasers and satellites to map every square inch. And when he finally walked into my kitchen with the results, he had this look on his face, a mix of disbelief and dark amusement. He laid out a transparent overlay on my kitchen table and said, end quote, Elias, I don't know who did their oppose, internal audit and oppose, but they didn't oppose. T just moved the line toward you. They moved the entire western boundary of the development to hide something massive, end quote. He pointed to the far side of the line, where Beatrice's personal estate sat, a sprawling, glass and stone mansion she'd finished building just a year ago. According to the actual legal coordinates recorded with the county, Beatrice hadn't an oppose. T just, end quote, nudged, end quote. The line, she had built her entire 3-car garage, her heated infinity pool, and a massive 2-story stone patio on what was undeniably 100% my property. She tried to steal a 30-foot strip of my driveway to distract me from the fact that her $1 million backyard was sitting on nearly 2 acres of my timberland. The irony was so thick, I could have cut it with a chainsaw. She thought she was playing a game of chess against a simple mountain man, but she'd forgotten that I was the guy who wrote the rules of the game. I spent the next month gathering more than just maps. I talked to a kid who lived in the development who'd been flying a drone for a photography project, and for $100, he gave me time-lapse footage from the last 2 years that clearly showed Beatrice's construction crew crossing my fence line and moving rocks and trees to hide their progress. I also got a call from a disgruntled former HOA board member who'd been ousted by Beatrice. He handed me an encrypted thumb drive containing emails where Beatrice explicitly told the developer's surveyor to, end quote, adjust the field notes, end quote, to accommodate her pool design because, end quote, that old hermit next door would never notice, end quote. But Beatrice wasn't an oppose. T done being arrogant. Before I could even file my countersuit, she decided to throw a, end quote, sunset soiree, end quote, for the entire Whispering Ridge community, and she had the audacity to set up a long catering table and a wine bar right on the stone patio that, as I now knew for a fact, was built on my land. I sat on my porch with a pair of binoculars, watching these people in linen shirts and sundresses sipping Chardonnay on my property, laughing and talking about, end quote, preserving the vista, end quote. I didn't oppose. T called the police then. I didn't oppose. T wanted to stop the party. I wanted to end the war. I walked down the hill, still wearing my work boots and a grease-stained shirt, and stepped right onto the patio. The music stopped, and a dozen pairs of eyes turned toward me like I was a wolf at a garden party. Beatrice floated over, her face hardening into a mask of pure condescension, and said, end quote, Mr. Miller, This is a private function for residents only. Please return to your cabin, end quote. I just smiled a slow, easy smile and reached into my pocket. I pulled out a handful of pink surveyor's tape and started tying it to her expensive wrought iron patio furniture. End quote. What on earth are you doing? End quote. She hissed, her voice low so the guests couldn't and oppose. Tea here. I leaned in and said, loud enough for the front row to catch every word, end quote. I'm marking the salvage. You see, Beatrice, I had a real survey done, the kind where you don oppos. T moved the pins at night, and it turns out this patio, that pool, and about half of your kitchen are currently trespassing on my land. So, since you're so fond of and oppos, community standards and oppos, I've decided to enforce mine. The party's over, end quote. She laughed, a sharp, nervous sound, and told everyone I was, end quote, unwell, end quote, but then I handed her the certified report from Silas and a copy of the drone footage stills. Her face went from a pale ivory to a sickly, mottled gray in about 4 seconds. I told the guests they should probably finish their wine on the grass, on the actual HOA grass, because as of tomorrow morning, I was filing an injunction to fence off my new patio. The legal fallout was a tidal wave. When we got to court, Beatrice's lawyer tried to argue, end quote, adverse possession, end quote, and, end quote, good faith error, end quote, but I played the emails from that thumb drive, the ones where she talked about, end quote, adjusting the field notes, end quote. The judge, a no-nonsense guy who grew up on a ranch, looked at Beatrice like she was something he'd found on the bottom of his boot. He didn't end oppos. T just rule in my favor. He issued a mandatory demolition order. Because the structures were built without valid permits on land not owned by the builder, they were classified as, end quote, unlawful encroachments, end quote, that had to be removed to restore the integrity of the land deed. Beatrice was ordered to pay for the removal of the pool, the patio, and the garage, plus 3 years of back rent for the land she'd occupied, and a massive punitive settlement for the intentional tampering with federal survey markers. The HOA, terrified of being sued for complicity, immediately stripped her of her presidency and her membership, and when the bank realized the house she'd built was now missing its garage and had a massive legal lien on the title, they foreclosed. I watched from my porch as the jackhammers came. It took 3 weeks to grind that stone patio into gravel and fill in the pool, and every day I'd sit out there with my coffee, listening to the music of justice. But here's where the story takes a turn I didn't end oppos to expect. When the house went up for auction, it was a wreck, a luxury mansion with a gaping hole where the garage used to be and a reputation that was radioactive. No one wanted it. No one except the, end quote, old hermit, end quote, next door. I bought that house for pennies on the dollar with the settlement money Beatrice had to pay me. I didn't end oppos to want to live in it. It was too sterile, too full of bad energy, but I knew someone who did. I contacted a group that works with veterans struggling with PTSD, guys who need a quiet place to heal, a place where they can learn a trade and feel the ground under their feet again. We spent the next year turning that mansion into a retreat. We converted the, end quote, great room, end quote, into a library, the master suite into a counseling center, and we used the reclaimed land to start a massive community garden. Now, instead of Beatrice's, end quote, sunset soirees, end quote, I hear the sound of guys working in the garden, or the quiet murmur of a group of vets sitting around a fire pit where the infinity pool used to be. The, end quote, visual harmony, end quote, of the neighborhood was definitely disrupted, and the HOA tried to fight me on the retreat, but I reminded them that I still own the land and I've got enough legal documentation to keep them in court until the next century. They eventually backed off, and now, ironically, some of the residents actually volunteer at the retreat, realizing that maybe, end quote, community, end quote, means more than just matching paint colors. I still sit on my porch every morning, and the ridge looks different now. It's not just a vista anymore. It's a reminder that some lines are worth drawing, and some are worth erasing. Beatrice moved away. Some say to Arizona. Others say she's still trying to sue her surveyor. But me? I'm right where I belong. The mountains are still there. The pines are still whispering, and for the first time in a long time, the air feels honest. But it makes you wonder, doesn't an oppos to it? How many other people are living a life built on a lie? just hoping no one ever checks the pins? If you found out your neighbor was literally standing on your ground, would you fight for the dirt, or would you let it slide just to keep the peace? Personally, I think some fights are necessary to find out what you're actually standing on. Let me know what you think in the comments. Was I too harsh on Beatrice, or did she get exactly what she planted? And if you've ever had a run-in with an HOA that thought they were the Supreme Court, I want to hear about it. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who try to take an inch and lost a mile, because out here in the high country, the truth always has a way of coming to the surface.